Hello, friends. Welcome back to Reiki Women Podcasts. My name is Michaela from Heartscapes Reiki, and with me today, as always, is Bronwen Logan of Reiki with Bronwen and Carrie Varela of the Reiki Healing Society. Continuing our conversation about the system of Reiki, about how it integrates in our life, and how we can leverage this incredible system of practice to be more rooted, to be more spacious, and more connected in our lives. Today, the topic that has risen to the surface is one that is really quite dear to me. It's really at the heart of how I approach my practice and is one that can be incredibly challenging to work with and also deeply important. And that is the topic of vulnerability. Vulnerability is the experience of intentionally putting ourselves in harm's way, in a sense, right? Opening up our shield and bearing our soft underbelly in some way, whether that's emotionally, mentally, physically, in relationships, in our own life. And it's a topic that's really pertinent to practicing the system of Reiki, partly because to really be in the practice, it requires us to be vulnerable, to relax, to let down our guard. And it also is something that can be very challenged by being in the practice of Reiki. So it's an interesting paradox that I've run into in my practice, and I'm really curious to see how it resonates with the two of you. So I'd love to turn it over to you, Bronwen, to see what comes up for you when you think about vulnerability.
Hmm. Yeah, it's such a big subject. When I think of the word vulnerability and the system of Reiki, I guess I think about people talking about protection. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is, and by what I mean by that is, so people feeling that they need to protect themselves against certain things. So you mentioned some things there, Michaela. You said uh, physically, mentally, emotionally, that we need to protect us, that some people feel that, they need to protect themselves. And I think to a degree, I agree. Haha, you never thought I was going to say that, did you? No, no, I do agree to a certain degree. In those areas, I mean, we need boundaries. Yeah, we need to be able to say, I don't like what's going on here. I need to look after myself. I'm in a situation where this is not healthy for me, whether it's something that I'm doing or whether I'm in the space of someone else or others, and something is happening and we're not safe in some sense, then I definitely agree. We need to protect ourselves, look after ourselves. Self-care, is the possibly the other side, the other side of the coin. Yep. I guess what interests me about this subject, though, is a different side of this. And that is where we're talking more, because it's a system of Reiki, we're talking more about energetically, spiritually. And this will depend upon people's perspective. So what do they think it means to protect themselves energetically or spiritually? And do we need to do it? I guess those are the areas that I consider rather different. I think a lot of people, even when they're talking about spiritually and energetically, I think they're in their head. And I think that they are mentally constructing stories, yeah, because that's what we do. That's what humans are great at. And that those stories may be confused sometimes with what is going on energetically or spiritually for someone. So, or maybe in their minds, they're imagining themselves as something that they're not, possibly. Yeah. And this is just from my perspective, of course, and I'm just one person on the planet. But what I do think is that if we look at ourselves energetically, so a Reiki class is probably a really good place to begin. I always tell people that we need to let go. And that can mean for people a whole bunch of things, but it does mean that we need to let go of holding things between ourselves that don't need to be there. And I guess with this, I'll go in a little more detail. So say that it's a hands-on healing treatment, then do I need to, as a practitioner, for example, need to protect myself from the person that I'm about to do a treatment with? Or can I be vulnerable and not go down that path? So my suggestion is vulnerability, because that means openness. And it means that we are not holding on to things within ourselves, consciously, unconsciously, but even the intent to be open is going to allow ourselves to physically relax, mentally, hello pussycat, mentally let go, and also to start to soften things, to let those spikes possibly flip over. I was actually writing an article about this, and I'll finish it one day, but in that article I actually talk about this. The idea, when I think of vulnerability, I think of those little creatures, like a little, we have like echidnas, or what is the other one? Anything with spikes on top, right? Yeah.
Porcupines.
Porcupines, thank you. I knew there was an equivalent. So, porcupines, and like a little baby one, and they're so cute, but they've still got all their spikes, and they're wandering around the place like this. But when you turn them over, and they've got that beautiful soft pad underneath, and that is their vulnerability. And being able to show that to the world is really very beautiful, because we can see the inside, what's inside the porcupine, right? But otherwise we never get to see what's inside, and inside never gets out. So another little analogy that I thought of that was like Leonard Cohen has that song, that's where I'm going to quote it totally incorrectly, but that's where that's where the light gets in. What is that? Like there's a crack, and that's where the light gets in, but it's also where the light gets out. Yes. So we can share ourselves and share our lives on an energetic and a spiritual level, without fear, I believe. And I think any of the fears that we create around that are simply that, fears, and they're actually mind-produced things. And that, for people who might feel that there are entities, or I don't know, external things that are affecting them energetically, spiritually, then that is a part of their universe and their world, and that is a manifestation of their fears. So they're things that need to be worked through, for sure, right? But not things to be protected against, because it's actually a part of that person's world, their universe. And if they can come around to an understanding that their universe is actually them and their perspective on life, then I think that they can actually find that they have a lot more control and empowerment in that, and understand that they can do something about it. And it does allow you then to have more freedom and more the ability, the potential to be more open. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. There we go. Anyone else?
Well, I can share a little bit here. That's an interesting way of kind of moving through this topic. And I wasn't exactly thinking in this vein when I was thinking about vulnerability, just that blanket or umbrella of the topic. But I really appreciate your perspective, Bronwen. And I think vulnerability is something that breaks down barriers. And that's something that we talk about in this podcast as kind of one of our focal points of an aim to break down barriers, especially for women's leadership within the world of Reiki. And in my perspective, vulnerability is one of those things that gets us there. Because sometimes when you're talking about breaking down barriers, it's about being tough and it's being like hard, and maybe it kind of implies some sort of inherent conflict. But I think when we are in conflict, maybe with our significant other or really anyone, when we can drop down our own walls and really share our hearts and share our point of view, share our perspective, that breaks down barriers and it opens up avenues for more clear and conscious communication, heartfelt communication, and that can almost very quickly resolve conflict. However, that being said, vulnerability without safety can be dangerous. And if somebody is sharing vulnerably, but sharing to somebody who isn't offering a safe environment for that heartfulness, and or maybe judging somebody, that doesn't help. That is just because it puts up more walls of pain and defensiveness around it. So, okay, buddy, you can go ahead and have that. Kiddos home from school today, so navigating that. Hi, Jai. So it's important, and I think so. Then there's another layer of vulnerability for our Reiki clients, right? So if we're providing Reiki to others, there's a vulnerability of being open, and I think that's what you're speaking to, Bronwen, is a safety and a freedom, an openness. I think it really does boil down to safety, of feeling like I feel safe that I can be open, energetically, spiritually. And in that process, potentially tackling some of the fears that arrive when we're open. And because maybe we've all had that experience where we've been vulnerable and shared something of ourselves and had that been, thrown back in our face, or we're judged or labeled, etc. And that's always, of course, unfortunate. But, truthfulness and honesty, it's bigger than that, right? It's bigger than somebody else's perception or judgment. And so, vulnerability is an incredibly important aspect of giving and providing Reiki. And then, even if you've been a Reiki practitioner on the journey, I think it's also about, willingness to be and put yourself in that position of client, of being emotionally and spiritually vulnerable to a transmission of energy. And I know for people who have a lot of energetic sensitivity, they struggle with this, right? Like they feel like they pick up emotions off of people, or very sensitive to dynamics in an environment, that they can kind of absorb that. And I do that for sure. And so what you were saying, Bronwen, it kind of reminded me of this experience I had when I was doing that pilgrimage through Japan. And I went to this temple, and it was called Temple of the Cloud Dragon. And it's this beautiful mural painted on the ceiling of this temple. And then inside of the mural is a dragon. It's really elaborate, beautiful dragon. And the whole trick with this is that wherever you are in the room, you look up, the dragon's eyes are always on you. Dragon's eyes are always on you. And to me, that's an experience of vulnerability, because what is really the dragon's eyes is consciousness. And that when we're talking about entities or spiritual awareness, it's being conscious to those fears, to the emotions that maybe are under the surface of things or in our subconscious, and being willing to look at them in the light of day, right? Like being willing to like actually be open to those, and not stuffing down our emotions or our perceptions, because our emotions, my yoga teacher taught me this a long time ago, and it's so relevant, is our emotions are like a beach ball. And when you push a beach ball underwater, you can keep it underwater for a good amount of time, right? But as soon as you're not looking, or not engaging in that avoidant behavior, what happens is, it pops way up and our emotions spill up and out. And so that's part of healing too, is being willing to be kind of in this space where our emotions are upwelling, that we might be feeling something that feels very painful or potent, but to trust and sit with those emotions, to acknowledge them, and to work with them. And sometimes I think you can get a long way doing that in a healing session, whether it be through Reiki, whether it be through counseling, but working through those emotions with other people. It's a really good way of getting out of it, because like you said, so much of the stuff is also in our head. It's about the way we think about the world. And especially if you have like a clear cognizance, or you get messages, or you have, kind of this spiritual awareness, some of that could be in your head. And I was thinking about that the other day, because I've been working with a business coach lately, and I realized that so much, like, I've had a lot of conversations with her in my head. And actually that's not really helpful, because what I want is her real grounded, solid advice, right? And so it feels like there's might be that spiritual connection between us. But that can also reflect back to us, our egos, our insecurity, our our ability. We all have blinders, right? We all have blinders. So when we're talking real life in person to person with people, even if it's over Zoom, right? We have that opportunity to look beyond those blinders, and see from a different worldview, see from a different perspective. So I think that that's really important. I'm sure, Michaela, you have lots of thoughts on this topic as well, so I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, there's so much here, and it's so interesting when we choose a topic like vulnerability. That's a really wide open topic, right? And we don't plan ahead of time. We don't know which direction the conversation's going to go, and that always leads for me to some interesting musings as we're going along. So there's kind of two directions that are working. I was going to say fighting for space in my brain, but that's not quite right. Two different directions that are on my mind. So the first is kind of what had come up for me originally when I contemplated this topic. And that's the connection between vulnerability, again, the willingness to expose ourselves to potential danger, to set down our armor, and to be, our bared self, bare ourselves to whatever is there. The connection between that experience and the precepts, and in particular, the 5th precepts on compassion. And, when I'm thinking about the system of Reiki, I'm typically thinking about it from the inside out, from my personal practice outward to my practice with other people. And so I know that in my practice, and I've seen this be true for a lot of folks, the experience of being compassionate for myself, or for others being compassionate for themselves first, which is how we're invited to approach compassion with the precepts, and then extending that compassion to others, requires often a lot of vulnerability. And it sometimes can require really setting down maybe years, maybe decades of armor around shielding ourself, our consciousness, our conscious mind, from whatever aspect of ourself we aren't ready to deal with yet. And it's generally that aspect of ourself that requires our compassion, and that most needs a compassionate approach and lens and touch from ourself first and foremost. And so that was what came up for me originally, is the how these precepts so often are so simple and yet can be so difficult. And when we think about extending compassion to all of ourself, right, all of the pieces of ourself, and then extending that compassion to all of the parts of other people, it does require us to set down our boundaries, or not our boundaries, but our armor, and to be vulnerable. And that's such a profound gift that we can give ourselves, and it can be so difficult. For many of us, that is a big piece of work that we need to just be with for a good piece of time. And so I just, first wanted to make this connection between compassion, or between love, essentially, and vulnerability, because we can't truly love ourselves or somebody else without being soft, right? Being in that vulnerable state.
Can I just say something
And,
before you go
yeah.
on? Just to add to that, I just saw a lovely comment. It was an article by Jack Kornfield, and he was talking about meta meditation, which is where we we experience that love for ourselves, and then we expand that out into the world. And he was saying, actually, we find it so difficult to give that love to ourselves that he does it the other way around. He said we often find it so much easier. And I thought this was really unique because it's not how I thought about it, but it's a great idea that we love we love others, right? We love others. And so to feel that love and then acknowledge what that feels like and then bring it in and see how that feels, to feel that love that we feel for others and how that then feels for us. And I thought that was a really, sort of like a inverse sort of meditation in a sense, but can be so difficult, right, to feel that.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. I actually had that conversation in the other podcast that I do over on my YouTube channel, Reiki Crossroads and Connections. One of my guests was talking about her journey with healing from an eating disorder, and how, when she was in the early stages of her recovery and working in groups and kind of being in supportive, loving community around this thing for the first time, that was exactly what she ran into. She had no capacity to love herself in that time. Like, she despised herself in that time. And she just needed to get physically well, right, to begin with. And by being in this community, she was able to extend genuine love to the people in that group because they were being vulnerable, right? She was witnessing their vulnerability, and that it was easy for her to extend her heart out to those folks. And over time, that extension of her heart to others in this genuine way circled back on herself. And so it was exactly what you're saying. It was this necessity to genuinely love others first. And I think for me, what's been so valuable about approaching the precepts from the, compassion for self first, and then others, that kind of put the oxygen mask on yourself first, is from the perspective of somebody who, in my life, I was very codependent and I was overly giving and overly loving to other people, but it wasn't that vulnerable love. It wasn't that genuine love. It was there was real love there, right? It's not a black and white issue. It's not a dualistic thing, right? There was real love. I'm talking about, family members and such, but so much of it was in a certain sense transactional. Like, I need to do things for you so that you can make me okay. And in my journey, coming into a place of solidity with my own positive self-regard was necessary in order to love people in a more clean way, in a less transactional way, in a way that wasn't anxiously dependent on them loving me back in order for me to be okay. And so having that conversation with Shani on my podcast really deepened my appreciation for the fluidity and the flexibility of how we can work with compassion, with love, with vulnerability as a tool for healing. Because for her, it was exactly the opposite. Like, she could not have gotten to self-love without the genuine love for others. And it was the container of the group that was focused on coming back into wholeness and healing and vulnerability and connection that allowed for that love for others to be clean. And I think this was the distinction that became important to me, is that we can love and express compassion in ways to ourselves or to others in ways that are not clean. And different strategies are going to work for different people as far as how to cleanse, right, the compassion that we're showing to other people. And it's intimately connected with our ability to be vulnerable with ourselves and others. And so oftentimes, working with safety, as you were talking about, Carrie, it's an interesting thing because there's also the other piece that's present in this is courage, because vulnerability inherently implies that there's risk, that there's danger, right? If there wasn't risk, if there wasn't danger, it wouldn't be vulnerable. Vulnerable is defined as exposing ourselves to harm. or potential harm. And so there's this way in which courage also comes into the mix, to be willing to set ourselves down. And we have to trust in our own capacity and our own resources to a certain sense to tend to our safety if necessary, our own resilience if safety isn't afforded to us. So it's this complex like mix, and each of us is going to have our own recipe of how much courage is needed, how much vulnerability we're willing to extend, how much safety we need to be already present in the container before we're willing to set down that armor. And each of us and each of you listening gets to make those choices, right? You don't have to set down your armor if you don't fundamentally feel safe enough, right, to do so. But if you don't feel safe enough, then that's a question of assessing the situation. Do I not feel safe enough because this situation is not safe? In which case, perhaps you need support in getting out of that situation. Or do I not feel safe enough because there's something in me that I need to extend some compassion towards, some love, some foundational, do I need to build something up inside of myself so that I feel safe enough, right? To be vulnerable and to be compassionate, to be loving. And that is true whether we're talking about work with ourselves, there's no one else involved, or work with others. And so much of, good therapeutic settings involve creating this container that's safe enough, but also involves risk. Because stepping out of what has become comfortable, which oftentimes our armor becomes comfortable, right? Because we feel safe inside there, right? And so it often requires us to get a little bit uncomfortable, right? To be a little risky, to be a little courageous in order to step into vulnerability, to step into compassion. And sometimes a Reiki session can be a place to practice that, right? To come to a practitioner who has solid integrity and ethics in place, who, has some training in how to hold some space, who is not going to overstep their boundaries as far as their own professional capacities, and is going to be able to provide some loving care and attention inside of a container of safety. So Reiki session can be an incredibly powerful place to practice vulnerability, to practice compassion. So that's part of what came up for me. And I think that piece actually bridges to the piece that the two of you have brought forward, and that Bronwen, you brought forward around protection. I feel like there's a whole other conversation in that maybe will be a topic for another podcast. But around this idea of how we orient towards what is actually happening in a Reiki session, right? So now I'm talking about with another person. That causes us to feel that we do or do not need to put like layers of protection into place. And a lot of this comes down to, again, our own perception and our own belief about what is happening. I have specific beliefs and perceptions about what I believe is happening in a Reiki session that are different from what some other people believe. I cannot say with any 100% certainty that what I believe is correct or accurate or true. Right? It's what my experience has shown me to be true. It's what my studies and my direct engagement with the practice has shown me to be true. It's what I believe very deeply to be true. But things that other people have experienced also lead them to believe that the other things are true. And so, when we talk about whether or not a person might be afflicted with an entity, for example, something you mentioned earlier, something that has come into them from the outside, and that perhaps in a Reiki session or a shamanic healing session or some other type of practice that can be removed from them. And there's a lot of protections and boundaries that are involved in a procedure like that. I cannot say that isn't a thing that happens. It's not something I've experienced. When a person comes to me and says, I believe I have an entity inside of me, can you help me remove it with Reiki? We need to first have a conversation, because that's not how I perceive what's happening. What I perceive that is happening is more akin to what you were sharing, Bronwen, that there's some tension, there's some friction inside of the person that is born from their own experience that Reiki could certainly potentially help with. But I am not going to Like I don't have in my practice, in my wheelhouse, a practice of removing entities and putting protections and boundaries and things in place around that kind of concept. And so I would not be the right practitioner for that person if that is what they believe and what they feel that they want. There have been times when I've had a conversation with a person who comes with something like that, or like, I think somebody's attacking me psychically is another one that sometimes people talk about. Or I've got a cord, an attachment to somebody that needs to be cut by a procedure, right? Those sorts of ideas. There's been times when we've had a conversation and I shared my perspective on that. So, in terms of that cord cutting and attachments, for me in my belief system, that attachment is inside of me, right? If I feel like I have an attachment to somebody else, there's a cord that needs to be cut. That's inside of me. And that's something that my Reiki practice significantly impacts, right? My perception is not that there is a dangerous thing happening with another person that needs a barrier put in place or that needs to be removed, right? So that's just not how I conceive of it. That's not how I approach it. And that's not how I'm going to approach it with a client. So again, if that's the perception that a person has, then I'm not the right practitioner. But there's been times when I've explained that, and that perception has actually made more sense to the person. And I've said, okay, well, let's try it your way, right? That makes sense to me, right? That actually there's something going on inside of me, and that I actually have the power to impact it, right? That Reiki is coming from me. It's not coming from outside of me into me to do something to me. It is me, right? It is me. And therefore, I am actually the one who has the power to change it inside of myself. And that change is going to involve vulnerability. It's not going to involve armor. And so that was the other piece. That was what came up in listening to the two of you, is this idea of what we believe is happening has everything to do with whether or how we're going to approach the practice, right? And whether or not we believe that we need to put up boundaries and protection, and what that looks like, right? Because boundaries, as you had said earlier, is necessary. There's times when we need to, be away from somebody, right? And not engage with somebody, or limit the engagement with somebody. But that's different than like a psychic boundary. Oh, yeah. So anyway, I'll pause it there. We got the kids home. We got the kids home. They're on the phone. They're making noise. I'm going to mute myself and pass it on to you.
Oh, well, what do you think, mister? Well, no, look, I agree with all of that. And like I said, I do think that it is a mental, in my experience, I've probably said all this before, but I'll repeat myself. This idea that we are the center of our universe. And so we are all the center of our own universes. And that universe is a construct that we have created around us. And how, if I see myself as a victim in that universe, then I'm definitely going to be a victim in that universe. Or if I, whatever I feel about this universe that I'm living in, that's what I experience. That is my world. And that might sound awful, but it's actually empowering, I feel, for me, because it means that it's something that, if it's my world, if it's my understanding, then it's something that I can do something about. You mentioned courage, Michaela. We need the courage to fight our fears. And I think that's so true. And it's something that, where do we get that courage from? I don't know. Maybe you guys have, hopefully the system of Reiki gives us some in on that. But yeah, courage it's just this tangible thing that pulls us through and supports us and helps us. And if we look at it from a treatment, I agree entirely that it's this thing about how we see the treatment. And we can see it in different ways. And look, I'm not putting people down who say that, I've got an entity or anything like that. I'm just saying different worldview. And I do, and my worldview, for me, I feel it supports me. Yeah. So it supports me, like I said, in feeling more empowered and being able to do something about what is going on and how I feel and how I see things. So it's something where I can always be working on and, in my own self-development. And just about treatments. So I know, Carrie, you used the word transmission, and I know, they're just words, but, I think that sometimes, these are the words we need to look at. And I don't think that the word transmission is, I'm not picking on you, Carrie. I don't think the word transmission, though, is going to be helpful in that situation, because it does have this like me and them sort of thing, which is very disconnected. And it seems to me like a word which it's also me transmitting something to someone. And so it's got this very, I don't know. It means that someone's doing something to someone. There's a lot of things about that word that always freaks me out a little bit. So I don't know, maybe, I like to think of, I guess I see it more as sharing, and us being, I always tell clients when I'm doing a treatment, I go into a meditative space and I'm in that meditative space with them, and their body feels that, and it knows that space because it's a home space. It's a space without the fears and the worries and they join me in this space, and together, and it's in that space that we both have that intention to become whole. And so that's how I would support someone in a treatment. Yeah. And I guess that's, sort of a different sort of way of explaining it. And yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I can segue off of that. I think it is important to evaluate how we look at things, and really fundamentally look at our worldview and what we perceive is happening inside of a Reiki session. Yeah. One of the things that I think of Reiki is, this idea of, okay, let's use a different word. I think of soul, right? Is I have a soul. And I believe that that soul is connected to the soul of everything, which I would call Reiki. Or if we could say energy, I have energy, but that energy is connected to the energy of everything. And yeah, or one other way of saying it is that there's this microcosm that is me. And then there's a macrocosm. There's this bigger picture. And I think that Reiki takes us into this place of a bigger picture. And so our experience of it might be a transmission of energy, or feeling of transcendence, going into a higher place of consciousness. That's certainly my perspective, my point of view, because I know that I can only house so much Reiki energy. Like I'm the microcosm, right? And I'm in my own world. I'm in my own universe. There's a tantric exercise where you sit inside of your own universe and you visualize a pinball bouncing around every single edge of thought that you've ever thought. Think about the whole of your consciousness, right? And being inside of that. So, I agree that, each of us have our own worldview. We have our own facet of the truth. If the truth is like a multifaceted diamond, we all see it from one perspective and we're looking at the same thing. In that worldview, we talked about cord cutting. This is actually a part of traditional Reiki in some senses. You look back to Fudomayo, one of those essential practices that he's practicing is cutting the cords of, and it could be connecting to some negative energy perhaps, but it could also be connecting to those patterns and thoughts and beliefs that don't serve us, that kind of put us constantly back into the realm of our wounds or victimhood.
Full negative energy.
And yeah, and I've had the experience of being in negative energy, experiencing negative, having negative energy come through in a treatment, come through in different capacities, right? And so that's my worldview. But but I don't think that's separate, from what you guys are saying. I think it's so important. Like we talked about feeling a negative psychic entity, and there was another layer of that of psychic attack, feeling of psychic attack. And for me, I agree. I think, well, first of all, I believe that could be happening energetically for people. But I think it also could be a reflection of their nervous system. Why is this person feeling like they are in a state of fight or flight?
Yes.
And if they can reflect back on that, they can see more fully, they can take control of the situation a little bit better. Yeah. And to me, it also comes back to that cloud dragon, is that you're wrestling with your own demons. And that might be what you're experiencing, is a feeling like you're wrestling with your demons. And also to recognize that we can go into a place of deep conflict with people. And I experienced that once where I felt incredibly misunderstood by somebody. We had a falling out as friends and in a different way. And it took me years really to recover from that, because there was a big part of me that kept wanting to show this person, no, this is who I really am. Why can't you see this part of me? And they just, in my mind, it was all happening in my mind, right? And so that's reflected also in my energy. And so I think we have, we have to greet our clients where they're at, right? And so if that's happening inside of ourselves, is taking conscious steps to switch out of this place of like, this is something happening to me externally, rather taking control of that internally, saying like, why do I feel like I am being attacked right now? And there might be something really rich and real that comes up when we look at it through that way, that we can again take more empowerment from. But the consciousness, this whole world of spirit is a mystery. It's just a total mystery. And I think some people, I know that they have incredibly gifted, intuitive gifts. They see entities. They can communicate with the spiritual world on a different level. I think that that's outside of the wheelhouse of Reiki. But as we've talked about before, that there might be some places where they really overlap, and the work of Reiki might help awaken that kind of gift in somebody. But it really comes back down to truth. How much are we just practicing discernment for our own truth? And if you go to a psychic reading, it's we have an ability to create that reality too, right? And so I think you have to, if you go all the way, if you just drink the Kool-Aid, you're out there with all of your archangels and guides, there's a problem there too. There's a concern there because there might be a dissociation that's happening, a giving away of your power and your ability to make decisions for yourself to something outside of yourself. And so those are all things that I've really wrestled with in my own application of Reiki, how I choose to show up as Reiki practitioners, because I think a lot of people come to me expecting me to be a medium between them and that world. And that's just not my gift. That's not how I relate to the practice. And I think that's something that we've all bonded with, although we have different points of view, obviously, in this.
But I mean, things are very word orientated. And, when you talk about the microcosm and the macrocosm, for me, that is this idea that Reiki is in me. Yeah. And I'm in Reiki, which is exactly that. Right. And I always say, we're not a cookie cutter. We can't be a cookie cutter, because I can't say where your energy might start and where your energy might end, and we don't know. And as you say, it is a mystery. And we can work so much with our minds, but maybe sometimes we need to just get out of our heads and just experience it for what it is, right?
I want to just kind of highlight a couple of things that you brought forward, Carrie. One is to just reemphasize that we really need to work with the right practitioner, right? As I was saying, like, I don't take the perspective that there are not experiences where there is something like an entity. That's just not my practice. And so I would not be the person to work with. And I have colleagues who work in, realms that are more aligned with that I can really gladly refer people to. It's really important to have a good referral network of people that we trust and that we know to be in integrity with their practice, who can work with people in different ways. Again, when people come to me with those perspectives, I share with them the way that I would hold that, which is really an inside out, like an internal perspective. So for example, you mentioned Furumyo. When working with that energy and with that metaphor, for me, Furumyo is an aspect of each of us. It's not an entity outside of ourself that comes and does something to us. It's an aspect of ourself that we've given form to in a creative way, so that we can access that part of ourself. And so that part of me that is fierce and that is grounded and that is, inflamed and that has this sword of wisdom and that has this rope that can pull the truth in, that part of me is going to cut those cords of attachment. And what I would look to a practitioner for is to guide me to that part of myself. And so that's how I would hold that for other people. Which is why Furo is tattooed on my arm, because it's like, this is the part of me that can facilitate that kind of cord cutting. And so it's of course part of the beauty of our world that there are so many different ways of thinking and working with systems of thought. And I think the question that each of us can ask, to your point, Carrie, of getting out of balance in one direction or another, because out of balance from, an inside out perspective might look like, well, I don't need help from anybody ever, right? This is a solo battle. This is only about me. I have to do this myself. Not getting help from anybody. On the other side, the over reliance on guides and facilitators and practitioners and such. So I think in either direction, right, there can be this out of balance place. The question is, are we in good integrity with our own beliefs and the way that we engage them? And then are we well aligned with the people that we've called in to help us? And our relationship to vulnerability and what that means and how we engage with that and how we engage with courage is a point of we can look at that to find those points of commonality with other people when we're making decisions about who to work with. Because, having those good alignments is really important, right? We want to work with practitioners who have a similar worldview or have a worldview that might be different, but in a way that's compelling and that we might want to move towards. So yeah, I think that's it. That's an interesting road that this topic of vulnerability took us on. I'm wondering if anyone has any closing thoughts as we come to the end of our conversation.
One thing that I want to say is not about this conversation is that we are quickly approaching our 100th episode. And so if you're not already part of our Embodying Reiki with the Reiki Women podcast group, you can find us on Facebook, join that group, and we're going to be offering a fun and interactive 100th episode that's coming up soon. So keep your eye out for some more information about that in our Facebook group. And we're really looking forward to sharing 100 episodes of the Reiki Women podcast. Who would ever believe that we got here? But it's super easy because all three of us, we can sit down and have great conversations with just even a one-word prompt. And it takes us to places like we went today.
Beautiful. I love it. All right, friends, share with us your experiences with vulnerability, with finding the right practitioner that's aligned with you, and anything else that came up for you in this conversation. If you have topics you'd love for us to talk about in the future, drop them in the comments. We'd love to respond to what interests you. Join us over on Facebook to get in on that 100th episode action. And until next time, we love you. Thanks so much for being with us. Bye.